Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, and today I'm honored to be joined by former National Security Advisor and Hudson Japan Chair, Lieutenant General retired Dr. H.R. McMaster, Dr. Tosh Minohara, Professor of International Relations and Security Studies at the Graduate School of Law and Politics at Kobe University, where he also holds a joint appointment with the Graduate School of International Cooperation Studies, and Dr. Yurika Ishii, Associate Professor at Japan's National Defense Academy and a leading authority on international law and maritime security. Our subject, maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific as tensions simmer, is timely but perhaps understated. After all, in the last couple of days, we've seen major destruction of property by North Korea. We've seen the first blood spilled in combat by the PLA under Xi Jinping against India. We've seen stepped up maritime coercion in the South and East China Seas, and aggressive political warfare, lawfare, and even wolf warrior diplomacy against Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, and others. As the Chinese ambassador to Sweden said earlier this year, we treat our friends to fine wine. For our enemies, we have shotguns. And all of this while we are in the middle of a pandemic and a global economic crisis as well. So let's begin the discussion on North Korea. This month, June, marks two noteworthy anniversaries: the hope for peace and the tragedy of war. The last week was the second anniversary of the Singapore summit, the first ever encounter between a sitting US president and North Korea's leader. The Singapore Declaration aspired to define a new relationship, chart a course toward peace, work toward denuclearization, and account for missing soldiers from the Korean War. Next week marks the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War, when North Korea launched a surprise invasion across the 38th parallel. This week's demolition of a multi-million-dollar joint liaison office in Kaesong that was opened only in 2018 veers close to the second anniversary than the first. That is closer to the tragedy of war than the hope of peace. Blowing up a vacant building on your own territory is another instance of North Korean blackmail diplomacy, a way of saying emphatically that you've broken your promises, South Korea and the United States. You've not given us enough, you're not listening to us, and what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. It's also a way for Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, who announced the threat on the weekend, to burnish her own credentials for future possible leadership. That recalls for me Kim Jong-un's role in 2010, before he became leader and replaced his father. He oversaw the lethal uses of force against the corvette Chonan sinking of South Korea and the shelling of Yangpyeong Island on the northern limit line. So the first question, and beginning with General H.R. McMaster, and then moving on to Professor Minohara, and then Professor Ishii. First question is, how do you view the severity of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and the growing North Korean threat? And what can be done, what should be done to preserve peace on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia? General McMaster.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. And what a privilege it is to be here with Professor Minohara and Professor Ishii. I admire your work tremendously, and it's an important topic and really a critical time. I think all of us realize that COVID-19 has not frozen any of these conflicts, and in fact may have catalyzed them as we've taken our eye off of really what's happening in some critical flashpoints across the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly now on the Korean Peninsula. I think it's important to note that these latest provocations by the North and these threatening words. I mean, I think Kim Yo-jong said, that soon the army would take action, right, to cool off the indignation of the people. And these are very threatening words and matched with threatening actions. I mean, I think until March it was the most missile launches per year to that point than in any other previous year. The cutoff of communications to the south, and then of course increasing border defenses now. So I think these are signs potentially that the North is increasingly desperate. I think they're desperate because we probably don't. Nobody should believe that there are no cases of corona in North Korea. We've had these prolonged absences of Kim Jong-un. I think there are signs that maybe the maximum pressure campaign is working, especially because of the effect of COVID and the shutting down of trade in the North. Of course, we've seen these reports of binge buying in Pyongyang, a disruption of the food supply chains there mainly. And I think this is happening at a time when there's, I think, a complicating factor for Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime, which is this class of sort of new elites in Pyongyang who may not be willing to see their quality of life plummet based on the mismanagement, the corruption of the regime in North Korea. So I think what we have to really recognize now is that the regime is probably desperate to get back to the cycle of provocation, extortion of concessions in exchange just for the willingness to talk, after which they'll drag out long negotiations, end with a weak settlement that locks in the status quo as the new normal. And the status quo, they hope, is a status quo of a nuclear armed North Korea. And of course, this is a great danger to the whole world, for the reasons not only based on the direct threat that North Korea would pose South Korea, Japan, the United States, and the world, but the threat that it would pose in the form of the non-proliferation regime breaking down, as well as the fact that the North has never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody. And so I think we have to really ask the question, okay, why? Why are they pursuing nuclear weapons at such a grave cost when they don't really have the money? I mean, they've spent 35% of their gross national income, at least, right, on defense. And they spent $620 million on the nuclear program in the past year. So why are they doing this? I believe Kim Jong Un might really adhere to this Juche ideology and believe that this nuclear capability would be the first way to push the United States off the peninsula, and then use that as the first step to unifying the peninsula, red-colored unification, or under the red banner. So I think it's extremely dangerous time. What do we do? I think we have to demonstrate our ability to respond to this threat effectively militarily. As you know, there are exercises scheduled for August. I think those ought to be robust exercises. I think from a diplomatic perspective, we need to resolve these burden sharing issues with South Korea and with Japan, and show the strength of U.S. bilateral relations both with South Korea and with Japan. And then I think what we should do is work over time to resolve the South Korean Japanese issues as well, because I think every provocation from the North should be seen by the North Koreans and by the Chinese as driving us closer together and strengthening our resolve to confront this aggression from North Korea. But it is, as I mentioned, a very critical time, and I'm very anxious to hear what Professor Minohara and Professor Ishii think about the situation and what we ought to do.
Thank you, HR. And we're going to turn to Professor Minohara right now, and I agree with you entirely. We need to strengthen our alliances because that's something we can actually achieve. We don't seem to be able to change North Korea's opinion very well. Professor Minohara.
Yes, hello to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a privilege to be with Patrick, General McMaster, and Dr. Shi. Yeah, this North Korean issue, I think, is one issue that really shows you how much the world has shifted amid this corona pandemic. Because I think we've sort of forgotten the term CVID was used, and we don't talk about CVID anymore. So I like to joke, from CVID to COVID, right? Now we all talk about COVID, and we've sort of forgotten about CVID. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that we now casually throw around the word new Cold War. But if you're in Asia, the Cold War was not very cold. As a matter of fact, I mean, the Korean War was a very hot war. And the Korean War is referred to sometimes as a forgotten war. I think we need to remember, we cannot forget this war and the consequences that it had. A second Korean War can definitely erupt on the peninsula. I think things are very unstable as things now stand. And it's not just about the weapons of mass destruction. It's the fact that South Korean policies towards North Korea, I think, are very dangerous. I think what Moon Jae-in, his kowtowing, and he's willing to acquiesce to North Korean demands, is interpreted as a sign of weakness. So what I am worried is the possible neutralization or perhaps Finlandization of South Korea. And this could happen. Who knows what the American commitment is under the current administration when it comes to South Korea. I hope, you see what happened in Germany recently with the reduction of troops. Something similar to that could happen also in South Korea. So I think, in my terms, what's really important is a reassessment of American policies towards North Korea. And I think I think President Trump's transactional approach, the approach as though he's dealing as though this is a real estate deal, I think really won't work in the long term. So I think a reassessment is critical. We talk about Japan's role, but I think compared to the United States, I think Japan's role is quite minimal. You know, Japan can apply economic pressure, but in the end, it's the United States and also probably China. But I think this situation could actually really spiral out of control in miscalculation. I think Kim Jong-un, I like to call him KJ. KJ is you know, he's probably a really smart guy. I think very dangerous, but I think his sister is a lot more ruthless. So, and they're young. And when they're young, I think you lack experience. You tend to make rash decisions. You tend to, I think, overestimate your capabilities. And I think this is a very, very dangerous combination. So, yes, we need to really realize that, you know, even though we're focused on COVID right now, that we need to think about what's going on in the peninsula. Now, when it comes to Japan, I think, you know, I've lived in Japan for quite some time now. I think that the Japanese people need to realize that human rights is a universal value. And I say this because when the Japanese look at the North Korean issue, they look at one single issue, and that is the abductee issue. Recently, Mr. Yokota passed away. It was heartbreaking. He was not able to meet his daughter who was abducted, Megumi-san. But it's much more than that. You know, it's not just about Japanese who were abducted. This is, you know, a human rights issue. I think Japanese need to empathize. It's either that, the abductee issue, or it's the nuclear weapons. But, you know, we need to look at the fact that there are many, many North Koreans who are struggling or being tortured. You know, so you can't stand idly by. I think the Japanese need to open their eyes and look at the reality and say, you know, we need to be a positive force for change. And I just don't see that. I think Japan tends to like stand on the sidelines and sort of, you know, try not to ruffle any feathers. But I think, you know, is that possible? Now, in conclusion, I think Moon Jae-in made his famous speech where he says, you know, he'll seek reunification by 2045. And I think he very well may get his wish, but not on the terms that he had thought. You know, he actually may be swallowed by North Korea. So that's like just throw out my ideas and give it back to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Tosh. And Professor Ishii, I mean, Japan doesn't just sit on the sidelines. Obviously, it has a very sensitive relationship with South Korea and has to be careful about how it signals the role it wants to play. But it's interesting how the international law intersects so much of what North Korea does, because it's essentially a gangster state. I mean, whether it's the violation of sanctions, the abduction issue, even blowing up a South Korean paid-for building in Kaesong, I wonder, raises legal questions for me. I don't think you can cause a war by blowing up a building on your own property, but at the same time, it was paid for by South Korean money in goodwill, and it's certainly a rough signal. But how do you view this issue with North Korea right now?
Thank you. So I'd like to start off by thanking Hudson Institute for a kind invitation. It's a great honor to join such eminent speakers. And also, I like to confirm that I am speaking on my own capacity and not representing any organization that I belong. So I realized that all of the topics we are going to discuss today is about the regional tension caused by the US-China competition. And I'd like to emphasize that there are rules and norms that govern this competition and ongoing conflicts in these countries. And also, there is already established regional security architecture in East Asia, and the US-Japan alliance has been one of the pillars of that architecture. And I'd echo both General McMaster and Professor Minohara that it is important to maintain this alliance. However, we've seen that this system has been shaken, and the threats posed by DPRK is the very symptom of such a malfunctioning of regional cooperation. I think we should separate two moves here. One is North Korea's effort to sever the ties between South Korea and the United States. And I think that the destruction of the liaison office in Kaesong could be situated in this context. The other is the North Korea's pursuit of its nuclear programs. And here we have to think about the effects of the sanctions posed in various ways against North Korea. So here I'd like to focus on sanction enforcement issues in the process of the denuclearization. And I have to say that it has now become quite difficult to achieve the CVIT, complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of its nuclear program, precisely because there are faults in United Nations economic sanctions, US-North Korea negotiation, and US ROK, Japan Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, or TCOG. So there are various challenges, but here I'd like to focus on two issues, but I think the most important challenge. The first point is that the US-North Korea deal has been stalled. We knew that it has been a difficult deal because it is an asymmetric deal. So that means that the US commits to provide security guarantees to the North Korea, and in return, North Korea commits to complete denuclearization. So of course, North Korea is violating its obligation under United Nations Charter. But because North Korea already has nuclear weapons, the stake has been quite high. So in order to make this deal happen, the United States has shown its willingness to deny the intention to attack North Korea, restrict the capacity to attack North Korea, and institutionalize the security guarantee through, for instance, the conclusion of a peace treaty, and to cooperate for economic development through investment. However, the last US DPRK negotiation in Hanoi in 2019 failed after North Korea did not show its full list of nuclear facilities other than Yongbyon, and negotiate to agree on the concrete process of the nuclear nuclearization. So the annual report published by the panel of experts of UN Security Council Sanction Committee in this April stated again that DPRK has violated the resolution through illicit imports of prohibited goods, among others. And it is reported that this could be possible, not only because of China and Russia, but other countries such as Thailand and Malaysia. So this malfunctioning is nothing new, but we know that the economic sanction under United Nations regime is not working. So when this deal does not happen, that the DPRK at least freezes its nuclear program, I think the only way for the United States and its allies to put the maximum pressure against North Korea again. We knew that the worst case scenario is to allow North Korea continue its nuclear development and loosen the sanction. And I'm concerned that this is what is taking place now. With regard to the trilateral cooperation between US, United States, Japan, and South Korea, there is a formal agreement, but I would say that the substantial implementation has been weak. Both US, South Korea, and Japan, South Korea have hit the bottom recently. And I think Japan's option and maybe to ensure effective implementation of the sanction regime, but it has been difficult because of the lack of the substantial amicable cooperation in the region. So I'll stop here.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, just to put a sort of underscore what we might see with North Korea in the coming months, with the U.S. election coming up in just a few months in November, and with this demolition of the building in Kaesong as a warning sign, I mean, I think North Korea is going to seek a provocation, and they're going to give President Trump a choice, and that choice is going to be make a deal and be the peacemaker by giving us concessions. We won't give you anything except empty promises, but we'll give you a peace deal that will help you with your reelection, perhaps from a North Korean view, in exchange for not provoking, not doing more provocation. I don't think the president will take that deal. I mean, the president's already proven at Hanoi that he was willing to walk away, and I don't think there are that many votes for making a peace deal with North Korea. I don't know, HR, if you want to just come in with that one point, but I want to just give you 1 second on that, and then want to turn to India.
Yeah, I agree. I think an element of continuity in the Trump administration policy, despite the initiation of the summits, has been that not to repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts, right? And in particular, not to relax the sanctions until there is irreversible momentum toward denuclearization. And I think it's a really important point. As you know, North Korea is conditioned to believe they can get away with it. And I think the observations are right that the President Moon's policies, I think, have in some way encouraged that behavior as well.
We want to turn to the India-China sort of clash that's just happened on the border. This has been a long-standing standoff because the Himalayan frontier has never been demarcated. The '62 war, of course, China bloodied the Indian Army's nose, and some people see maybe what just happened on Monday night in Ladakh, eastern Ladakh, next to Jammu, Kashmir, where at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. This is the first time the PLA has been in combat under Xi Jinping's watch, where there's been lethal combat, as far as I know. That's a significant milestone, especially since Xi's been pushing the PLA. Let's show that we're ready for combat. But Professor Minahar, why don't you get us started with just a short reaction to how you see the level of India-China tensions?
Well, first of all, I've had the opportunity to go to India quite often. I have many friends there, and what my impression is that the War of 1962 has really traumatized the Indians. It really, really defines who they are vis-a-vis the Chinese. And so I think there is this inherent desire to overcome this past experience. Now, that being said, I think, of course, General would know much more than I do, but I believe the military capabilities of India is not on par with the Chinese. And the Chinese know this quite well. And so they're taking advantage of the situation, and they will take what they can get. Because it seems to be that the Indian troops are quite disorganized, perhaps not well led. These are, of course, my assumptions from what I see on the ground. Now, we also have to be careful on how far is Beijing cognizant of what's going on in the Himalayas. I mean, this is way far from the center of China, and it's also far from New Delhi. Perhaps this was a random event. I was told that they were told not to fire on each other, and they did obey that, right? They were clubbing each other instead. So perhaps they were following orders to that regards. But I think the Chinese understand the calculus. They understand that India is a weaker power, but may not be a weaker power like a decade from now. So they have to take advantage of the situation while they have the advantage. And so if I were Indian, I would say to myself, okay, let's really reconsider who our friends are. Because at one point, Modi was willing to reconcile with Xi Jinping. But now I think with this, post-pandemic world, I think the lines have been drawn in the sand. And I think it's important for all countries to really to give it some hard thought of to which side they're on. And I think for India, it's definitely Quad. And so what India needs to do is to really, instead of buying weapons and missiles from the Russians, I think they should really reorient themselves more to Europe and definitely to the United States, and perhaps get some serious training. I mean, I don't know what goes on, but I think the Indians could really use American military know-how to and to act as a deterrent. Because if the Indians are tough, the Chinese are not going to push in, right? I mean, look at World War II. When the Japanese fought the Soviets in the Monhan, I mean, the Russians were tough, and so the Japanese thought that affected Japanese calculus. Okay, well, we're not going to go into the Soviet Union. We're going to go down south, Southeast Asia. I mean, it's easier, and you always want to grab what's easier. So I think if you look at the situation on the ground pragmatically, realistically, I think it's very easy to figure out what Chinese motives and intents are. So with that, I'd like to conclude.
Yep, it'll be interesting to see whether India doesn't take much more seriously the military preparedness that it may need. It's been focusing on some military infrastructure there on the frontier, and India's been trying to beat back China's pressure because China doesn't want to see that military infrastructure build up.
That air base, right?
Yes.
They're making that air base, and this time the issue was creating that road that connects to the air base. And the Chinese realized they don't want the Indians to fortify it to get stronger. So, so it makes sense, yeah.
So H.R. McMaster, how do you see this situation between India and China?
Well, I think it's escalating for the reasons that Professor Minohara already mentioned, right? I think Xi Jinping has this combination of ambition and also fear that the window of opportunity is closing for him to realize his ambitions. And what I'm concerned about, and I think we're going to talk about other flashpoints as well here, but I'm concerned that really, what if the PLA is believing their own propaganda now, right? And is internalizing it and is acting aggressively, not only on the border here, but also in the South China Sea, also in the Senkakus. And I mean, I just think, I think that vis-a-vis Taiwan, that this is a flashpoint in large measure because of the emotional aspect of it, and I think that this is a real opportunity, for us to strengthen our military relationship with India, and then of course I think the regional dynamic is important to keep it in mind with Pakistan as well, and I think that Pakistan has a choice to make whether it's going to become a pariah state with a single sponsor of China, or if Pakistan is going to try to break away from that and to develop relationships that might be much more beneficial to Pakistan in the long term. So I think that there's a lot of military work to do here, but there's also maybe some diplomatic work and some opportunities as well. But I really am concerned that the PLA might be really believing its own propaganda. And then, of course, for Xi Jinping, he's in an echo chamber, right? I mean, how many people around Xi Jinping are going to want to tell him the reality of the degree to which the PLA can control a military operation, for example, on the border with India? So I think all of these factors make it an increasingly dangerous time.
Well said. And Professor Ishii, I want to give you just a chance to say something here about South Asia, but I really wanted you to focus on the maritime set of issues that I'm going to ask you just after your brief intervention on South Asia.
Should I comment on India-China relations? Or may I? I mean, actually, I have not much to add regarding the political analysis, but I just wanted to flag that legal question remains on what happened this Monday. It's a matter of international conflict, which is subject of the international law and specifically jus ad bellum prescribed in United Nations Charter. So basically, the use of force against another state is prohibited, even though it occurs in the disputed territory. And I also would like to flag that there is a relevant case on International Court of Justice, which happened between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, which is rendered in 2015. So in this case, Nicaragua carried out military activities in the disputed territory, which the court eventually decided to belong to Costa Rica. And what is important that the court held first, the activities were in breach of Costa Rica's territorial sovereignty, because in the end, the court decided that the territory belonged to Costa Rica. And also it held that the fact that Nicaragua considered that its activities were taking place on its own territory did not exclude the possibility of characterizing them as an unlawful use of force. So there's always a risk that the troops might violate Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, even though it occurs in the disputed territory. So should I move to the third point, or should I give the mic to you?
Yeah, Ishii-san, let me just stop you there and just turn to a sort of a group of flashpoints. We've already talked about India-China, which flared up this week. We've talked about North Korea. And I want to talk about China's coercion, especially maritime tensions in the East and South China Seas, but also toward Taiwan in particular. And let me just frame the sort of the challenge very briefly, because in January we saw President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan democratically reelected despite enormous pressure campaign from the mainland. China under Xi Jinping will be marking the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party next year, and there's a lot of political pressure, if you will, to contain China's democratic movement, not to mention Hong Kong's democracy movement. And China seems to have stepped up even in the midst of the pandemic with more maritime coercion. And we've seen, there was indeed a report just out in Taiwan earlier this month by two scholars at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research that talked about how on March 16, the Chinese fishing boats, some 10 of them were unintentionally ramming the Taiwan Coast Guard vessel. There was also the ramming of a Japanese destroyer. On April 2nd, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel sank a Vietnamese fishing boat. So there have been no shortage of maritime incidents because of Chinese aggression, a lot of them by their maritime militia, their Coast Guard, so their para-naval, paramilitary forces. And yet the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and People's Liberation Army Navy and Marine Corps are preparing, they've announced, a drill that would essentially approximate the seizure of Dongsha Pratas Island, an island I visited last year. And this exercise would occur this fall. This is Taiwan has a sort of a nature preserve, maritime marine nature preserve on this island, and they occupy it. So this is very threatening to Taiwan. Meanwhile, the United States has mobilized 3 aircraft carriers, the Reagan, Roosevelt, Nimitz, in the maritime space around this area, which they haven't done since 2017 when the nuclear crisis with North Korea was flaring up before the diplomacy kicked in. Anyway, so with all of that maritime tension and in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, between US and China, Ishii-san, how do you assess the situation in maritime Asia from your perspective?
Oh, thank you so much. So there are various aspects to this trends that China is pursuing its maritime interest in elsewhere in South China Sea, East China Sea, and against Taiwan's vessels. What I'd like to emphasize that is, first of all, China is of course subject to UNCLOS, United Nations Law of the Sea, which obliges member states to use the sea peacefully. And it is debatable whether harassing activities or provocative activities would be contrary to this obligation. But it seems that China is intentionally using this, the width of the interpretation of the international obligations. I also like to flag that there's a non-binding code for unplanned encounters at sea, which China has signed, this instrument sets the rule for navies to secure the maritime safety. And the recent activities of Chinese naval vessels seems to be contrary to the rules set in this document. Having said that, I'd like to separate the situations of South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, because all of them are different situations. So on South China Sea, I would say that there is a real danger that China is, gaining its maritime supremacy, considering the recent development of Fiery Cross and Mischief Reef. But here I have to repeat South China Sea arbitration finding that was rendered in 2016. The arbitral tribunal held that China's land reclamation and construction of artificial islands at Fiery Cross Reef, among others, caused severe irreparable harm to the coral reef ecosystem, and thus violated UNCLOS UNCLOS's obligation on environmental protection. It also held that Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation within the Philippines EEZ, and low tide elevation is not capable of appropriation. So it is hard to justify China's recent activities from that perspective. I'd like to also note that there are limits in the arbitration decisions. The tribunal is established under UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, and it is only capable of deciding on the interpretation and application of this convention. So that means that the tribunal did not have jurisdiction on the territorial dispute, and thus it did not hold anything about the legality of the reclamation of rocks or islands itself. Also, I'd like to note that in this kind of international relations workshop, it is often emphasized that the China, ignored the award after it was rendered. I should note that Chinese government did not completely, ignored or abandoned the judgment. The judgment has some effect. For instance, China stopped using the term 9-line, which the tribunal said had no basis under UNCLOS. Also, in 2018, Chinese Society of International Law published a report of 500 pages criticizing the award. So it means that the experts in China studied this award very well and tried to justify Chinese activities based on international law. So I think that those moves should count. So I mean, this does not mean that the actions in South China Sea could be justified, but I think it requires some reservation to say China totally abandoned the judgment. Turning into the East China Sea, I do not see it as a maritime supremacy, but as a matter of fact, China is increasing its naval powers, especially to Senkaku Islands. And also it continues the unilateral development of the continental shelf in East China Sea, where Japan has a potential maritime entitlement. Again, this could be resolved under UNCLOS. The harassing activities against another ship would be in violation of the established rules. And also the unilateral development of the constructions where Japan has potential maritime entitlement could be arguably against Japan's sovereign rights to the area. Also, regarding to Taiwan, which is quite complicated, it's not really a matter of maritime law, because the dispute recently has occurred when PRC is threatening Taiwan by its force. What worries me is that the escalation be intensified when the United States increases its engagement with Taiwan to send a message to Beijing that threatening Taiwan by force is dangerous, and the United States maintains its capability to defeat Chinese potential invasion or Chinese fait accompli against Taiwan. Of course, it is important to send that message to Beijing, and I think the alliance and partnership with the United States in the region should play an indispensable role here. But the recent move shows the provocative actions on both sides, and I think this escalation efforts and the potentially the building up of the confidence building measures are necessary. So I will stop here.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Professor Ishii. Now, Professor Minohara, you looking at how Japan and the United States have tried to stand up to this kind of lawfare and gray zone sets of operations and preserve a rules-based system in all of these areas, despite China's assertions, is a real challenge. I'll just mention one thing on, Ishii-san mentioned the limitations of going to the Permanent Court of Arbitration when the Philippines had their ruling go their way. Well, just recently, just this past month, in fact, a very alarming article coming out of Peking University, out of an elite institute focused on marine and maritime security, a Chinese professor, of course, working closely with the government, inseparable from the government of China, arguing effectively that if Vietnam goes the route that Philippines does and tries to pursue arbitration, here's a list of bad things that could happen to Vietnam. It was a veiled threat, and not very thinly veiled. So that's how China plays the game here. So, with all respect to Professor Ishii as the expert in international law, the problem is that international law and norms only cover a sliver of international discourse and behavior. And the question is, what can Japan and the United States do in a place like maritime Asia on these issues?
Well, Japan is quite on the arbitration issue too, because it doesn't suit the outcome doesn't necessarily suit Japan's interests as well. I mean, Japan has these rocks that they call islands, right? So I don't want to get into that lest I be censored, but yeah, it's a delicate issue. Dr. Ishii, I really respect your work as an international legal scholar, and I understand that the legal framework is quite important. But that being said, I mean, my perspective, I'm not a legal person. I look at powers and how they act, and I think the very definition of a great power is that you redefine international law so that suits your own needs, right? And when I speak with the generals and admirals from China, and they're very clear, their ambition is not hidden in any way. They want to be able to create the new norms, the new legal framework that suits their own country. And so I think, it's important that we have these frameworks, but yet we can't just, try to bind China to what we have, because China believes inherently that these frameworks are unfair. And there is a historical analogy to this. I mean, the 1930s Japan. I mean, when I meet Chinese diplomats, Chinese officers, I mean, their rhetoric resonates with what Japan was saying in the 1930s, how it's unfair and it's this Anglo-US led system that's inherently working against us, so you want to change the system. So I can understand the Chinese motivations and the Chinese drive. I just don't agree with, because I believe in democracy, human rights, and whatnot. But you can understand the reason why China is doing what it's doing. Going back to your question, I like to sort of look at the big picture, what's happening. I think what I'm really afraid is, because of the slow American response to the COVID and what happened to the U.S. Navy. There was a momentary vacuum which the Chinese wanted to fill. But I'm more worried about the Chinese rhetoric that's coming out right now from their country, and that is they're making a mockery of democracy. They see America as being weak with the protest, the Black Lives Matter. I mean, they're like making it's a big joke now how America is no longer as omnipotent as it once was. But I think such rhetoric unconsciously or subconsciously leads to an underestimation of American power. And so I think the Chinese could miscalculate. They could say, oh, America is not that strong, they're pushovers, and this would be a terrible mistake. If you look at American history, you know that's not the case. That when push comes to shove, the Americans will stand up, stand up for what it believes in. And so this is why I think the situation is very dangerous, that the Chinese are not really grasping the true nature of America. Now, I think there are a lot of issues. The South China Sea, I think, is particularly important because it shows you that the Chinese changed the realities on the ground. I'm not going to say overnight. I mean, we knew what they were doing, but we let it happen. And now they're there. And I have friends in the U.S. military who tell me, no, it's not a worry. We can knock out those bases with our missiles. And I'm like, what? The fact that we're firing missiles means that we're at a state of war. So short of war, they have changed the realities, and they've won. And I think it's a case where it's game over. And now they say it's a vital core interest. Now, mind you, in World War II or before World War II, the Japanese referred to Manchuria as a vital national interest. And what that means is that they'll go to war to protect that. And so I think that's game over. Hong Kong, unfortunately, I think is game over. I'm a historian, like analogies. I think it's Sudetenland. It's Hitler going into Czechoslovakia. And as Hitler did that, the world stood by. I think with Hong Kong, no one's going to go to war over Hong Kong. So I think the critical issue would be Taiwan. And I think Taiwan will be the Poland. It'll be the 1939 Poland. That this will be a moment where we will all stand up and say that's enough. But mind you, when Poland was invaded by Hitler, France and Britain did declare war, but yet they did not act. So what's going to happen in Taiwan? Because in Taiwan, there's no American bases. This is not Okinawa. But of course, military logic dictates that if China were to integrate or strike Taiwan, then it would make sense to strike Okinawa first, which would automatically involve not only the Americans, but also the Japanese. And so, this is the thing. I think the Japanese do not see the Taiwan issue as intrinsically linked to their own national security, when the reality is that it's very linked. And so I think it's just generally the Japanese need to reassess their security identity. It's no longer about being protected by the Americans. It's about what can we do together. We had the rugby match last year. It's that one team concept. We are one team. And I think we need to really strengthen that. When it comes to, again, Chinese rhetoric, the Chinese, remember how they used to always say peaceful rise? I never bought it because I've never seen a major power rise peacefully. But the Chinese don't say that anymore either. And you know how they used to say peaceful unification with Taiwan? Well, the recent People's Congress, the term peaceful was dropped. Now it's just unification. And if you're Xi Jinping, you want to be the greatest leader in modern Chinese history, if not, to prehistory. And in order to do that, he needs to overcome the legacy of Mao. And what did Mao fail? He failed to unify Taiwan. So that's the ultimate prize. If Xi Jinping can do this, he will be the hero of the Han people for ages. And so I think this is the drive. So his ambitions are great. And I think when we are in democracies, we tend to, again, underestimate the ambition that these leaders and leaders, dictators in parentheses have. There are no term limits. Look at Putin. He has drives, he has motivations, and we just can't. We need to, I think, factor that in. And so I'm very worried. I'm worried about the exercises that will take place north of Taiwan in August. So we're talking about all these flashpoints, and all these flashpoints happen to be in Asia. And I think Japan needs to step up, really step up. And I say this because I lecture to Japanese college students, and they have no concept of security whatsoever. the Japanese military is seen basically as a force that comes in after a national disaster. That's Japan's security identity, and that's, I would say, not a very good security identity to have. So, I mean, and I don't want to jump to the end of what Japan should do, but obviously we know what Japan needs to do, right? How do you redefine your security identity? Well, there's only one way. You have to revise your constitution. Now, another thing that is very worrisome is what Japanese scholars, a few scholars, and also a prominent LDP diet member said, is that Japan should act to work between the United States and China. That we should be the middleman. We should be able to negotiate. I'm like, what? From when does Japan have that status? And I thought this was nuts. And I spoke to a very prominent Japanese former diplomat, and I told him about this, and he laughed. He says, "How ridiculous! Have we forgotten that we have an alliance with the United States? And what does an alliance mean? It sure as heck means that we can't be in the middle, right?" So the fact that people can say this, that Japan acts as a go-between, to me it really shows you that a lot of people have not really grasped the reality. And so I think it's better that we wake up now. And when we talk about the Constitution, it's better to revise the Constitution during peacetime than it is during wartime. So that's the big thing. But again, Japan is a country that often reacts to the international situation, does not act proactively. So no matter what I say or what we say, I think in the end, Japan will only change when it's really forced. It's like Perry knocking on Japan's doors, except this time it might not be Perry's black ships. It could be somebody's black missiles, right? So.
Well, very poignant set of remarks, and I'm sure a lot of thoughts there for Professor Ishii. She's thinking about the Japanese perspective in terms of how this plays. But turning to H.R. McMaster on these issues, there are two basic facets here that I think really are on the table, H.R. One of them is how effectively we can work with Japan as an ally. And you were masterful at working with the National Security Secretariat of Japan and working with the Abe administration on really pushing forward a strong alliance. And the question is, where do we go with that? The other question, though, that Tasha's raising is the potential calculus of Beijing and of Xi Jinping. You alluded to it in your opening remarks on Korea, but there really could be what we might call a miscalculation, but they might think is the right calculation, that this is the time to act, this is the need to act. They may confuse sort of the protests in the streets in America with weakness. As somebody who grew up in California in the 60s and watched these protests, I see it as a sign of strength. It's the resiliency of a democracy. We are so comfortable with disorder. We don't need the Chinese thousands of years of complete hierarchy and order to feel comfortable. We can put up with some disorder because that's voicing democracy. That's allowing everybody to participate in trying to improve and constantly reform and aspire to be the best we can. Not have a system give us the one message that we have to hew to, and we must follow the party line or else, and that's it. But anyway, I'm digressing. HR, your response to sort of this set of challenges with China, especially in Taiwan and the maritime domain.
Well, Patrick, I agree that we are much more comfortable with disharmony than the Chinese Communist Party is. And I think that they are fearful and ambitious at the same time, as I mentioned already. And I think the point that's already been made that, hey, we don't want to underestimate how ambitious they are. We tend to think, oh, they don't really want to do that, do they? And of course they do. I think what they want to do is they want to subjugate Hong Kong and Taiwan as the first step of excluding the United States from the entire Indo-Pacific region. This is why I think that we have a North Korea strategy. China has a U.S. strategy. How do you use the situation in North Korea to your advantage to get the U.S. off the peninsula and all that? What's the immediate goal of that? It's to isolate Japan, its main regional rival. And so what do we do? I mean, right now it's exactly as we've been suggesting. Everybody has to be strong and strong together. And just to tie this together, we really do need. I mean, President Moon, his overtures to the North have been spurned, right? And so I think it's time, for President Moon to take a much tougher stance and to show that he's not going to be able to be coerced by North Korea. This could be a way to bring us back together in terms of the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And China would take notice of that. Hey, the U.S. and its allies are reacting in a way that cuts against Chinese influence, and maybe this is a first step toward restoring deterrence by denial. I think the Quad Forum really invigorating that. India should be, an easier sell right now to join the Quad Forum along with Australia, based on the aggression that China, the aggressiveness of China on their borders. And I think it's time for us to really set an agenda, a positive agenda around the free and open Indo-Pacific. For example, we talked about India. Hey, everybody needs India to succeed, right? Because of the size of India, even a little problem in India is a really big problem. And I think what we really need to do is work together to strengthen India, help India succeed from a geostrategic standpoint. And then, of course, it really has a lot to do with military capabilities, as we're talking about, to convince China, the PLA, the Chinese Communist Party, you cannot accomplish your objectives through violence. And I think what we ought to do is point back to June of 1950. What was the calculation in June of 1950? Well, it was the wrong calculation. And so I think making that historical analogy is appropriate. But Patrick, as you've mentioned, as we've all discussed, especially in the context of international law, it's not just really deterring a direct conflict. It's also dealing with the Chinese Communist Party's more and more effective efforts to accomplish its objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a direct military response. This is, the greatest land grab, so to speak, in history in the South China Sea. It's also the use of the maritime militia, and more broadly, and we haven't really talked about this yet. I'd love to hear what everyone's thoughts are on this as well. It's also this campaign of co-option by the Chinese Communist Party, co-opting countries to support their worldview and their agenda, and companies to do that as well. And what this calls for, it calls for us to act together so that the party cannot divide and conquer between us. This gets to the point of really, we can't see Japan as a go-between here, and it's okay. Japan can be friendly with China when we're having a rough time, and vice versa. No, now is the time for us to really work together and to send a very strong message. Hey, I think the market's going to do it too. I mean, I can't imagine U.S. companies having a stomach for staying in China much longer now. I mean, especially with what we've seen in Xinjiang, what we've seen with the extension of the Orwellian surveillance police state, the actions in Hong Kong, the aggressive actions vis-a-vis Taiwan and in the South China Sea. I think companies are going to start voting with their feet and are going to try to minimize the coercive power that the party has over them. And then, of course, what's the reaction on China's part? Well, I mean, maybe the Chinese Communist Party leadership gets the message. Wow, maybe this isn't working. Maybe we should try a different approach and be less aggressive. But I don't think so. I think what is likely to happen is they're going to see that window of opportunity closing more rapidly. And I think there's a risk that they could become more aggressive. So I think everything has to be done together, right? There's a saying that, Japan, of course, we don't know the saying that Japan wants to be loved, right? And China wants to be feared. Okay. So I think what we should do is try to magnify the love in the region, and China and Japan has a tremendous leadership role in the region, as a counter to some of the below the military threshold activities of China. And then I think what we ought to do is try to make everyone less fearful of China, and do so by with real military capabilities among allies and partners to convince China they can accomplish objectives through the use of force.
Well, these have been great answers, and we're out of time, so I'm just going to give each of you a minute to kind of give a final riposte or thought. And I apologize. I'm going to start with Professor Ishii, who's been a very good sport here, listening to a lot of generalizations being made about security in the region, and she's being very precise about the rule of law. But I just would underscore the work you do, Professor Ishii. Reading in the Straits Times of Singapore this week, a speech that was probably meant to be given at the Shangri-La Dialogue that was canceled because of COVID-19. the Secretary of Defense, Esper, gave a very articulate discussion of how the U.S. working with allies and partners can maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. And he emphasized very much the rule of law. You know, whether we achieve our own objectives and aspirations or not, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to do exactly what you're helping guide Japan, the alliance, and in sort of international community to follow. So I just want to say we deep respect for what you're doing, even if that's not the behavior that we're seeing out of other actors. They don't give it as much sort of gravitas as it deserves. But your final comments here about what Japan or the Japan-U.S. alliance can do that might really benefit regional security across the Indo-Pacific in the coming months and years.
Thank you. So I would have two comments. One is a response to Professor Minohara. I totally agree that the rising power would like to, create a new norms, and states do create norms. That's what international law is about. I would have to say, however, that once there is a commitment to certain promises, then it has to be respected. And United Nations charters and the UN Convention on Law of the Sea are the most important instruments that China has been committed to. So it is fine that China reinterprets the provisions in the documents, but it has to respect what the constitutional setting is under those conventions. Regarding the Japan's way in this situation, I also have to agree with Professor Minohara that Japan is taking a responsive attitude, which was also demonstrated in the issue of Hong Kong's national security law. Well, if Japan wants to keep its status in the region, I think it is important to, take its position, even though the matter seems to be a bilateral or regional issues. So for instance, if there's a real issue concerning the regional security or even human rights, then I think it is the role of Japan to express that concern and let the situation fix to maintain the peace and security in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Minohara, final thought or recommendation.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Ishii, I'm a real broad stroke guy, so I'm actually learning a lot from you, so don't get me wrong. And I totally agree that we need to respect the law, but just too bad a lot of countries don't adhere to that. And I think the United States needs to act responsibly also. Reneging on the Iranian nuclear deal doesn't really send a positive message when it comes to following international law and whatnot, is what I would argue. So I think America, and this goes to my thing about America, America needs to lead more by example. And I think I would like to see more stronger American leadership, especially when it comes to promoting alliances. And who knows what President Trump thinks about NATO and whatnot. To me, it seems to be it doesn't really grasp the geopolitical nature and importance of alliances. In the past, I had a peace of mind because he had very capable advisors. He had Mattis. He definitely had you, General McMaster. I think I disagree in politics with Bolton, but his approach to North Korea I can completely sympathize with. But these so-called breaks or minds that really restrained in a positive way the president's decisions, I think, are now gone. And so, if in fact President Trump is reelected, it worries me. Who will really rein in on this president? And he has nothing to lose. This is his last term. So I think in many ways, I think the ball is in America's court. I mean, what are you going to do, and how is America going to lead? And I have two more small points, and the other one is decoupling. I think General McMaster referred to this, how American companies should decouple, and I totally agree. But when you look at the reality of what's going on, because American companies are not ruled by the United States, unlike China, because in China, the companies have to listen to the Communist Party. Their allegiance is there. And this is not true for American companies, that the Chinese are actually decoupling much quicker. I read a recent report about the latest Huawei cell phones, the smartphones. In just a year, their content of US products had decreased drastically. And another interesting point is parts of components of Korean and Japanese components had increased. So you see the Chinese decoupling with the United States, but increasingly coupling with China and Japan to make them dependent on their economy. And so because the Chinese government can order their companies to do this, naturally, their decoupling is much quicker. So I think we need to realize this, and we need to sort of coax these companies, American companies, and to say, hey, this is what's happening, and so we also need to do the same, or else China will have more leverage over us. And this is what I fear. The pace is different. And my final point is I talked about revising Article 9 is important because it changes Japanese security identity. And I stress this because I have a lot of colleagues here in Japan who say, oh, no, we don't need to revise the Constitution. It's a hassle. It's a pain. We've already reinterpreted the national security laws. That's enough. But that's not enough because these laws are complex. 99% of the Japanese don't understand these laws. Whereas if you change the Constitution, it really changes of who you are as a nation. And that's why it's really important to do this. And once the security identity changes, I think Japan needs to become a security provider. Japan is a member of G7, third largest economy, a formidable military force, even though most Japanese don't realize this. But yet it's always been provided security from the United States. Why can't Japan be a security provider in the region? Okay, and of course it's because Article 9 prohibits this. But Japan needs to sort of jettison its middle power mindset and realize that, hey, we are a big country. Right now Japan has a very large body, but on arms and legs of like twigs. This is not balanced. And I'd like to see Japan, and I don't think Japan needs to send troops to the Middle East, but if it's in your corner, if it's in your backyard, Japan should do a lot more. So about this FOIP, why is it in Japan the free and open Indo-Pacific concept? I call it FOIPs, and that S is there for a reason. It's a strategy. But yet the Japanese government refuses to refer to it as a strategy because the strategy is directed towards somebody, and we know this is China. So, and then Taiwan. Japan needs to defend Taiwan. If something happens in the Straits, Japan cannot, stand behind and say, oh, we'll send money, we'll support you financially. That's not enough. There's a colonial legacy, and I think it's Japan's moral responsibility to defend a democracy. But as it now stands, Japan can't do that. So I think it's both up to the United States and Japan to realize what's going on, how the world is shifting dramatically after COVID, and that we need to sort of rise up to the challenge and act together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. You've provoked both Japan and the United States here. And I think just before I give HR the final word on the substance of the program, I just want to quote from an outstanding article that's published in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs called The Retrenchment Syndrome by a fellow named HR McMaster. And it ends by saying, retrenchment may hold emotional appeal for Americans tired of protracted military commitments abroad, but blind adherence to an orthodoxy based on emotion rather than reason would make Americans less safe and put the United States further in the red. So, General McMaster, you have argued eloquently, both when you were in office and out of office and in uniform and out of uniform, for both alliances and for forward engagement. And you're sticking to your principles. But your final recommendation or thoughts on what might be done here for US and Japan to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific?
Well, Patrick, thanks so much. And really thanks for your leadership, Patrick, over the years in strengthening our alliance in so many ways. And and what a privilege it is to be at Hudson with you. Hey, I just want to point out that Professor Minohara sounds a lot like Donald Trump to me in terms of burden sharing, and so I wouldn't worry about the U.S. Japanese alliance. I think President Trump and Professor Abe have had a very strong relationship from the very beginning. And as everybody knows, these burden sharing arguments, they're not new. I mean, they go back, at least to the 70s, right? And in connection with NATO as well as with Japan. And so I think President Trump would agree with everything Professor Minohara said. And so I really felt as if when I was National Security Advisor, we were so completely aligned I think with Japan, that whenever I met with my National Security Advisor counterpart, Yachi-san, we just say, okay, well, how's your family? Because, there's really nothing to talk. We really agree on everything, and so I really think we can't take it for granted, though, right? So the one thing I'd like to say at the end is we have to work on the relationship, and the way to do it, because we're democracies, is Japan and the United States both need to explain to our people the mutual benefit of this wonderful relationship. And I just would like to end by quoting a former Japanese ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Ryozo Kato. He called the relationship, he said, the U.S.-Japan relationship requires gardening, right? And he went on to say that this relationship is one of the most beautiful gardens in the world, but a garden requires constant, thoughtful, and skillful care with a grand plan, which is what Professor Minohara was saying. It should be FOIPs with a strategy. I know we're working on it together. We're working together all the time. There is this narrative, right, of the U.S. is going it alone, but what I see is a high degree of coordination and cooperation with our Japanese allies, and so we just have to continue it. I think build on it and don't take it for granted. Treat it like a garden. And what a wonderful discussion and what a wonderful privilege to be with all of you.
Great discussion, and thank you, Professor Ishii, Professor Minohara, General McMaster. Terrific discussion. I want to thank also Ben Gilman for prompting me to kind of put us together online. And I want to especially shout out to Philip Pegseth, Patrick Thomas, and the whole Hudson Public Affairs team headed by Anne Marie Hauser, who are working late tonight here in Washington, D.C. to make sure we are able to put this program together and put it online tomorrow. Thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.